will be displaying the image along with more details on the image tab. So we'll display the image and title. If we go back to our application and if we examine the Blob service right here, we do not have any method that returns the image URI as well as title and comments. We only have getAllBlobs that return a list of all the string, which is the blob name. So we will have to create one more method here based on the container name. Let me copy and paste it here, and we will say getAllBlobs with URI. This will not be returning a string. We have created a model for blob. Let's return a list of blob. Let's stop the application and go to Blob service, and let me implement that interface method as well. Let's see where it got created right here. In order to get started, let's go to getAllBlobs here and copy a few things. We will need a blob container client as well as getAllTheBlobs. So let's copy those two lines and paste it here. Then rather than blob string, we will have to create a list of blob. So let me copy that. And this will be a list of blob, and we can call that as blob list. After that, we will have to iterate through this list of blobs. So let me copy this await keyword, paste it here. We will have to add the async, and perfect, the error should go away. Now here we won't be adding a string, we will rather create a blob object, populate the values, and add that to our list. In order to get the blob URI, we will need a blob client object. So we'll create a blob client using the container client that we have. And the name is not container, that is blob container client. On there we have a method which is getBlobClient that we have used before. We need to pass the blob name that is inside item.name. Once we have that, we will create the blob, and I'll call this blob individual is equal to new, and we can populate the URI. From our blob client we have .uri and absolute URI. Once we populate the URI inside the blob individual, it's time to get all the blob properties or the metadata. So we will create an object of blob properties. Let's call that the same is equal to. We will get that using blob client. So on our blob client, we have an helper method which is getPropertiesAsync. That will retrieve all of the properties and assign that to our blob properties. Then we can check on that blob properties. We will have an if condition. We will say if blob properties.metadata, if that metadata contains a key with the name of title, then we want to extract its value and assign that to our blob individual. In our blob individual, we have a property with the name of title that we can retrieve from blob properties.metadata. The key name will be title. We will do the same for comment as well. So let me copy title and replace everything for comment. Once we assign both of these properties, then we can add our individual blob to the blob list that we have. So blob list.add individual blob. And finally, after the for each loop, we can return back the blob list that we populated. So with that, our getAllBlob list with URI will have the actual URI as well as the metadata for title and comment. It will retrieve all of the blobs, and we will have a list of blob model. So with that, let's continue from the next video. Inside our home controller, let's create an action method and consume this. So we'll go to our home controller. Here we only have the container service, so I will also add the blob service using dependency injection. Once we add that, we can use this privacy action method, and let me call this as images, and we'll make that async task of iAction result. Here we want to use the blob service. So right here we'll say await underscore blob service. We have method get all blobs with the URI, and we need to pass the container name right here. We will just hardcode our container name. We have private container. Let me copy this and we'll display all the images inside private container. Let's go back to our master page underscore layout, and rather than privacy, I will change this to images. Lastly, we have to create this view. So if we go to home controller, images, let's add that view. It will be an empty view. We will call that as images. Let's add that. The model for our images will be list of blob. That's what we are passing inside the controller right here with the method get all blobs with URI. So we will retrieve a list of blob and we will display that. We will keep things pretty simple. We will have a class here with padding 4 and container. We will add a div with the class of row and a heading of images. Then let me add another div with a class of row, and within here we will have a for each loop, and we will iterate through all item in our model. So for each of the item, we will again create a div, give it a class of column 4, and we'll give it border padding 2. Inside here, let me display the title that is inside the item.title, and then I will add the image from item.uri. With that, let's run the application and see if this works. Let's go to our images here, and great, we see all the titles here, and we have the 3 images that were uploaded. This is working as expected. But one thing I want to notice is this is supposed to be a private container. So let's go back to our Azure and we will change the access level of our private container. So we'll change that to private. Once this is done, let's go back and let's examine our images. Let me do a hard refresh. As soon as you do a hard refresh, you will see the images are no longer accessible. The reason is straightforward. This is a private container and it cannot be accessed using the URI anymore. So what is the alternative? What if we want to keep some blobs private, but we want to grant access to our application? How do we do that? Let me walk you through an approach in the next video. You can see the images are no longer accessible. If we go back to our container and if we examine any of the image, we copy the URL and we paste that here, we get the error that the resource does not exist. One way to make this resource accessible is using the shared access token. Inside the blob that you are selected, you can see there is a tab here which says Generate SAS or Shared Access Signature. Inside the signing key, we have 2 keys. And the signing method that we will use is the account key that is there at the account root level. There were 2 keys, you can use any one of those. Then the type of permission that you want, we will keep that as read. And what will be the start time and expiry time for the signature? I'll just copy the start time, paste it here, and I'll change that by few minutes. That way it will be accessible for about 4 minutes. Let's generate the token and URL. Perfect, you can see we have the blob SAS token and we have the blob SAS URL. Let's copy this and paste it here, and great, you can see the image is accessible. Now what is different between what we had here and what is here? If you notice when I change the tab, everything till JPEG is the same. Something with SP is added right here. And that is what makes all the difference. So right here, let me remove this and let me examine what exactly is this shared access signature. The first thing is the SP here, which stands for permissions. The permission that we granted here was only read. That's why you only see R right here. Next is ST, which stands for start time. Then the next parameter is SE, which is the end or the expiry time. After that, we have the SPR, which is the protocol, that is HTTPS. If we go back, you can see here we have HTTPS only, and it is reflected here. Then we have SV, which stands for the storage service version. After that, we have SR, which stands for the storage resource. The resource that we have the signature on is a blob object. That's why you see a B right here. If this was at a container level, this would be a C rather than B. So it denotes the resource right here. And final thing that we have is the signature created with SHA 256 algorithm. The input for this algorithms are the blob URL or other query parameters and the storage account key. This ensures that the parameters cannot be changed as they are included in this hash value. It also authorizes access to the blob as the account key is also part of this hash value. So with this, we have seen different parts of the shared access signature. Since it has been more than 5 minutes, if I paste the URL again and if I press enter, you can see we get the error authentication failed because the current time has already passed the expiry time. So perfect, you have seen how to generate SAS and how you can access resource for limited time based on the expiry. Now this looks great from the browser endpoint, but what if we want to generate a SAS dynamically from .NET application and access our resource? How can we do that? Let me show that in the next video. Now we want to generate the SAS token from our .NET application. So basically what we want to do is the images that we see right here, we want to make sure that they are accessible by our application even though we have the level as private. We will change that using SAS token. So let me close all of the tabs that we have open, and the only thing that we will have to modify is the blob service. If we scroll down where we are retrieving all the blobs with the URI, we will modify our content right here. So we are setting the blob URI on line 49, but this URI will not be accessible since it is private. So we first need to check if a blob client can generate an SSA URI. If a blob client can generate an SSA URI, we want to create that. So for that, we will be using the class which is blob SAS builder. We'll do control dot to add the using statement. I will name this SAS builder is equal to new, and we will create few properties here. First one is the blob container name. We need to find out what is the container name of this blob account. We can either pass that from the string that we have right here, or we can retrieve that using blob client. So on the blob client, we have a method getParent blob container client inside the using statement of specialized. So we will call that method, and we want to retrieve the name of the container. Next, we need the blob name that is inside blob client dot name. The last thing that we have to specify is the resource here. Since we are creating a SAS token on blob, we will specify B that we saw inside the URL in the last video. On this SAS builder, let's say later on if you want to add more properties, you can add that by SAS builder.expires on. And let me set this to 1 hour. Of course, if you want, you can modify this directly while you are creating the resource, but I just wanted to show you the other way with typical objects. After that, on the SAS builder, we have to set the permission. So we'll say set permissions, and here we will use the default constants. Those constants are inside blob SAS permissions, and we can do all, but we only want to give them read access. So that is what we will do right here. If you want to do more, you can do something like this, but we will limit that to read for now. Once we have configured all the properties for SaaS Builder, then we can get the URL. That URL we will set in our blob individual.uri. We will overwrite what we have added right here. And that is inside blob client. We have a method which is generate SaaS URI. And here we have to pass the blob SaaS builder. So we will pass our SaaS builder, and that looks good. Now we need to convert this to an absolute URI. So let me do that. That will populate the new URI with the SaaS token. With this in place, let's run the application and see our magic. Let's go to our images. You can see it generates the SaaS token dynamically, and if you press F12 to inspect the element, you will see the new URL right here with the SaaS token. So that is how you can use SaaS token with your .NET application. Now the images in private container are being accessible because we have granted SaaS token at the blob level. If we remove this block of condition, if I comment this out and rerun, that will no longer be accessible. Let me show that. And great, you can see they are not accessible anymore. Now when we have to generate SaaS token, it is not necessary that that is done only at the blob level. We can also do that at container level. For that, let me copy everything that we have commented out, and I will paste that before the for each loop because we want to do that at the container level now. And let me uncomment this. The logic is somewhat similar. Rather than blob client, now we will be working with the blob container client. So we'll say blob container client, can it generate the URI? If it does, then we will have to configure the blob SaaS builder. For the container name, we can directly use the blob container client. On there, we have the name itself. We do not need the blob name, and this time the resource will be container, so it will be C. We can set the expires on, and the permission, we will leave that as read. Then this time it will give us a URI for the container. We can extract the secret token from the end, and that token we can use on all the blobs, and that will work. So how do we do that? Let me create a string here, SaaS container signature, and that's what we will use right here. Rather than blob client, it will be blob container client dot generate SaaS URI dot absolute URI. Now this will be the URI, but we want the signature part only. So we can split that. We know there was a question mark, so we will split that based on the question mark, and we will get the later part with the signature and convert that to a string. So this will have the token that is needed to access blobs inside the container. So what we can do is where we have the URI for all the blobs, we can append a question mark, and then we can use the signature right here. With this change, let's run the application and see what happens. If we go to our images, you will see the images are coming up again. If you examine the secret token here, let's go there, you will notice that the resource type is a container. And perfect, that looks good. So with this, we have seen how we can generate SaaS tokens at the container level.